Shalom Avrim, James Trim here once again. In recent videos, we talked about the restoration of the ancient sect of the Nazarenes. If you haven't watched that video, you definitely should. It documents that the original followers of Yeshua did not call themselves Christians and were not Christians. They were a sect of Jews known as the sect of the Nazarenes that accepted Yeshua as not as the founder of some new religion, but as the Jewish Messiah of Judaism. The so-called church fathers refer to them as and document them that they were the original followers of Yeshua. Again, watch that video. It's very important background information as we move forward with this video. I'll put a link to it in the description. And another video you should watch is the very recent video I did on restoring the house of Judah and in scripture restoration, and how we see in Romans chapter 11 with Isaiah chapter 29 that scripture restoration plays a very, very important part in the restoration of the house of Judah, which is the restoration of Nazarene Judaism. All of this is very important background information because today we're going to talk about something very exciting, and that is the ultimate restoration of the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which is a lost apocryphal gospel that is lost, that the so-called church fathers tell us was used by the ancient sect of the Nazarenes. And it's very, very important because this apocryphal gospel, this original Jewish gospel, is in fact the source, as we will demonstrate and show you in today's study, is the source for the Synoptic Gospels. And by the way, it was a source for Yochanan's Gospel, but it was really very strongly a source for the Synoptic Gospels. And we're going to get into that in detail. This is very important because this was, as we will see, the standard gospel used by the ancient sect of the Nazarenes. And so the restoration of the ancient sect of the Nazarenes should include the restoration of the gospel according to the Hebrews. Now, I said it's lost, but we actually have about 50 quotations from it found in ancient sources such as the so-called church fathers. So right now, we're going to start finding out everything there is to know about this lost apocryphal original Jewish gospel. As usual, we have handouts for this study, and I'll have a link to where you can find the handouts. If you're not watching this on Nazarene Space, they'll be right under this video. So one of the previous studies, we were discussing the connection between the restoration of the ancient sect of the Nazarenes and the restoration of the house of Judah, as the branches of Judah are grafted back into their own olive tree, which is actually the main point of Romans chapter 11, not the grafting of Ephraimite branches into the house of Judah, which is a very important message with the teaching the two houses. But if you really look at what Romans chapter 11 is saying, as we found in our last study, it has a lot more to do with branches from the house of Judah being grafted back into their own olive tree, which is the restoration of Nazarene Judaism. And we also showed the great parallel between Romans 11 and Isaiah 29, and how Romans 11 actually quotes Isaiah 29. And Isaiah 29:18 talks about this restoration, saying, "The deaf shall hear the words of the book, and the eyes of the blind shall see out of obscurity and out of darkness." And this has its parallel and fulfillment in the book of Enoch, in 1st Enoch chapter 104, verses 10 through 13. But when they write down truthfully all the words in their languages, and do not change or diminish aught from my words, but write them down all truthfully, all that I have testified concerning them, that's happening now, then I know another mystery, that books will be given to the righteous and the wise to become a cause of joy and uprightness and much wisdom. And to them shall the books be given, and they shall believe in them and rejoice over them. And then shall all the righteous who have learnt thereof all the paths of uprightness be recompensed. And one of the obvious candidates for restoration in the last days, and the restoration of the ancient sect of the Nazarenes, to play a direct part in it, is the restoration of the gospel according to the Hebrews. Now, I said it was lost, but we're going to find out that there's really more to the story, and why this is going to play a very important part in the scripture restoration project that I have been working on. Now, if we look at our handouts, our first handout is titled The So-Called Church Fathers on GH. GH is an abbreviation you'll see me using because Gospel according to the Hebrews is a little cumbersome. The 4th century church father Eusebius, in writing about the Nazarenes in his Ecclesiastical History, Book 3, Chapter 25, Section 5, writes, "And among them," i.e. the doubted books, "some have placed the gospel according to the Hebrews, which is the especial delight of those of the Hebrews who have accepted the Messiah." So here Eusebius is talking about books that are doubted in the Gentile church, if you will. And doubted means they're not banned. They didn't. It's just that some people accepted them and some didn't. And the Gospel according to the Hebrews was one of these books that was doubted in the considered a doubted book in the Gentile Christian church in the 4th century. But it was the especial delight of those of the Hebrews who had accepted the Messiah. Jerome, the Latin church father in the 4th century church father. Church father is an academic term. So-called church father gets a bit cumbersome to say every time. But Jerome writes in Against Pelagius 3:2, "In the gospel according to the Hebrews, which is written in the Chaldee and Syrian language, but in Hebrew letters, and is used by the Nazarenes to this day." Of course, this day being the time of Jerome in the 4th century, because the Nazarenes still existed then, and we're still using the gospel according to the Hebrews then. And then in his commentary on Ezekiel 18:7, he refers to the gospel according to the Hebrews again, saying, "And in the gospel according to the Hebrews, which the Nazarenes are accustomed to read." So the gospel according to the Hebrews was the especial delight of the Hebrews or Jews that believed Yeshua was the Messiah, and it was described as Jerome here as used by the Nazarenes to this day, meaning the 4th century, and which the Nazarenes are accustomed to read. But it was doubted by Gentile Christians. This brings us to a wonderful quote from Hugh Schoenfield in his book that he wrote in 1937 titled According to the Hebrews. Pages 13 through 18, there's some dots here in the text, so if you want to look at the handouts to see where the ellipses are. But he said, "The gospel according to the Hebrews is a literary outlaw with a price on its head. But in spite of the scholarly hue and cry, it still evades capture. Neither monastic libraries nor Egyptian rubbish heaps have so far yielded up a single leaf of this important document. He goes on to say, for behind Hebrews lies the unknown potentialities of the Nazarene tradition, which may confirm or contradict some of the most cherished beliefs of Orthodox Christianity. It is useless for certain theologians to designate Hebrews as, quote, secondary, unquote, on the evidence of the present fragmentary remains preserved in quotation. He goes on to say, judged by ancient testimony alone, it is indisputable that Hebrews has the best right of any gospel to be considered a genuine apostolic production. And he says, here is obviously a most valuable witness, perhaps the most valuable witness to the truth about Yeshua, whom even a jury composed entirely of Orthodox Christians could not despise, and who ought to be brought into court. But the witness is missing, and all that we have is a few reported statements of his taken long ago. So you can see how important this lost document is. So some things that we know about the gospel according to the Hebrews. What do we know about it, since we don't actually have it? Well, one of the things we know about it is that there were two different versions of the gospel according to the Hebrews, which brings us to our next handout. It was used by both Nazarenes and Ebionites. We'll do a whole video at some point on the ancient Ebionites. Here it's important to know that they split off from the Nazarenes around 70 CE, and they rejected the virgin birth, and they rejected the deity of Messiah, and they rejected a number of, they rejected Paul. They rejected a number of things that the Nazarenes did not reject. But the Ebionites and Nazarenes were two distinct groups. But they had a common origin. They were both Jewish believers in Yeshua as the Messiah, and they had a common origin in that the Ebionites split off from the Nazarenes. So Jerome, in writing on Matthew 12:13, tells us, refers to the gospel according to the Hebrews as the gospel which the Nazarenes and Ebionites use. So here we find out that they both used this book, but from Epiphanius we know that they didn't use the same version. The Nazarene version, which Epiphanius says that they used, was, quote, quite complete as it was first written. Panarion, chapter 29, book 29, chapter 9, section 4. To be clear, and I have this here in parenthetical under the quote, this quote actually speaks of Hebrew Matthew. However, I've included it because throughout the Church Fathers, there is a confusion between the original complete Hebrew Matthew and the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which we will discuss later. They may be the same, that they may be the same. In fact, that they are the same, and we'll cover that. This is compounded by the context of this quote, in contrast to the Ebionite text of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Everywhere the Church Fathers say Ebionites used only Matthew and do not mention Gospel according to the Hebrews, lending to the implication that they are the same. And there's other information to indicate that they are the same that we'll find later in this study. But the important thing is that in Epiphanius, his description of the Nazarenes, Panarion is a work by Epiphanius, a 4th century Greek church father, who is disputing what are considered heresies to the Gentile church, the Gentile Christian church. And the Nazarenes are covered in section 29, and the Ebionites as a separate group. Some people try and confuse them, but they were separate groups. are discussed in Penarion chapter 30 or section part 30, and thus testifying to the fact that they were a different group. So in Penarion 13, book 30, chapter 13, section 2, Epiphanius says of the Ebionites that their version of the Gospel according to the Hebrews was, quote, not wholly complete, but falsified and mutilated. Now, by the Middle Ages, the Nazarene version became known as the Gospel of the Nazarenes. So, in the Middle Ages, several authorities, or commentaries, fragments, and whatnot, sources will refer to the Gospel of the Nazarenes. It's clearly referred to the Gospel according to the Hebrews. However, the modern scholars will write and have referred to the Ebionite version as the Gospel of the Ebionites to distinguish it. But the ancient sources do not refer to a Gospel of the Ebionites, but rather to a Gospel according to the Hebrews. It's just that we know from this and other sources, this primarily is our best target at it, that they are different books. They're different versions of the same book. So the important takeaway is that the Nazarenes and the Ebionites both used the Gospel according to the Hebrews, but they used different versions of it. And we'll talk about that more later. The original language of the Gospel according to the Hebrews is something about which there's been quite a bit of debate. Eusebius refers to, this is actually our next handout, original language. Eusebius refers to the Gospel according to the Hebrews as, quote, the gospel that is spread abroad, spread among the Jews in the Hebrew language, or in the Hebrew tongue. This is in Eusebius's Theophina 4:12 on Matthew 10:34 through 36. And he refers to it as the gospel written in Hebrew letters in the same source on Matthew 25:14. Jerome refers to the gospel according to the Hebrews as, quote, written in the Chaldee and Syrian language, but in Hebrew letters, in Against Pelagius 3:2. Now, that bears a little explaining. If you've got an old Strong's Concordance, you'll see that in the lexicon portion, it refers to Hebrew and Chaldean, and a lot of old classic sources from the early 20th and 19th centuries will refer to Chaldean. Chaldean is actually Aramaic. Okay, it's a word for Aramaic, and in Syrian, when you talk about a Syrian language, it's referring to Syriac. Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic, and the church fathers often referred to Aramaic as Syriac because it was the language that was spoken by the Syrians. So when he says written in the Chaldee and Syrian language, he's referring to a single language that we call Aramaic, but in Hebrew letters. The problem is that Jerome seems to be referring to the same document that he says in another passage that it's, quote, in the Hebrew language and letters. However, if we want to scrutinize the context, it appears that what he is saying from his sources is that it was originally written in the Hebrew language and letters, but that the copy that he refers to as being at the library at Caesarea is written in the Chaldee and Syrian language, but in Hebrew letters, i.e. Aramaic. To explain that just a little bit more, there are a variety of ways that Aramaic can be written. There are different Syriac scripts. In fact, when it's written in cursive scripts, if you will, we usually call it Syriac. but it can also Aramaic can also be written. It uses the same 22 letter alphabet as Hebrew, and it can be written with the same letters that we call today Hebrew letters, which are actually originally Aramaic letters, and Paleo Hebrew letters are the original Hebrew letters. In fact, one of the terms in Hebrew for what we call block script, the script we also call it Ezra script, that we recognize today as Hebrew letters, is Katav Asherim, which means literally the writing of the Assyrians. Okay, Schoenfield, therefore, is quite Hugh Schoenfield in his book According to the Hebrews, page 241, quite correctly concludes that, quote, the original language of the gospel was Hebrew. It was generally been assumed on insufficient grounds that this Hebrew was in fact Aramaic, which commonly called Hebrew. Aramaic sometimes gets called Hebrew because it's written in Hebrew letters. The book of Daniel is written partly in Hebrew and partly in Aramaic, but all of it in Hebrew letters, for example. Let's move on to our next handout, which is titled Misconceptions. There's a lot of misconceptions circulating around about the gospel according to the Hebrews. And a lot of these are because scholars, unfortunately, oftentimes, especially in biblical studies, make assumptions or jump to conclusions based upon evidence that they see, and they uh, uh, based upon the evidence, they create an entire theory, and then that theory becomes widely accepted, even if it's on flimsy grounds. And when in fact the real evidence is really not there to support the theory. Um, so many scholars have attempted to make the Gospel according to the Hebrews into several different documents. These refer to the Gospel according to the Hebrews, the Gospel of the Nazarenes, and the Gospel of the Ebionites as three different documents. However, nowhere do the Church Fathers refer to a Gospel of the Ebionites. That's a modern term. Epiphanius says that the Ebionites used the Gospel according to the Hebrews and never refers to a document called the Gospel of the Ebionites. The term Gospel of the Nazarenes is also never used by the Church Fathers. It only appears in the Middle Ages, where it's clearly a euphemism for the Gospel according to the Hebrews. The presumption that there were three documents is taken its root in scholarship, unfortunately. Part of the basis for this assumption is that Clement of Alexandria, who wrote in the early 2nd century, and who was a Greek church father and wrote in Greek and did not know any Hebrew or Aramaic, quotes the Gospel according to the Hebrews in Greek before Jerome translated the document into Greek. Jerome says he translated it into Greek and Latin. So the assumption is that if Clement quotes a book called the Gospel according to the Hebrews in Greek in the 2nd century, it must not be the same Hebrew and Aramaic document that we're seeing referring to quoted elsewhere. Now, that's a possible theory, but it jumps to some big conclusions, because it's quite possible that Clement obtained his quotation from a secondary source that did know Hebrew and quoted GH in their Greek document, and that did an ad hoc translation. And there's any number of ways that Clement of Alexander could quote this quote from the Gospel according to the Hebrews in Greek prior to Jerome's translating it in the 4th century into Greek. That's just not enough evidence to jump to the wild conclusion that they're different documents. It's important to realize that we don't have every document that existed. So when we start looking at these things, we have to realize that we're putting a puzzle together with a lot of missing pieces, and we can't assume what those pieces were. We we don't have every document that Clement had access to, so we don't know that Clement couldn't have been quoting from some other source that quoted this book in Greek, in a Greek translation, or even some source that quoted it in Hebrew that got translated into Greek, and Clement was able to read it. Another misconception is the presumption that the 13 readings in marginal notes found in certain manuscripts of Greek Matthew under the title Judaicon, giving alternate readings, refer to the Gospel according to the Hebrews. While these readings agree, one of these readings agrees with the Gospel according to the Hebrews, and if they are quotations from an original Hebrew version of, well, they are, I believe, quotations from a original Hebrew version of Matthew, but they're in Greek, giving alternate readings. They probably agree with and are found in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. That much is correct. But identifying the Judaicon and the Gospel according to the Hebrews as the same document is a bit of a jump. Finally, let's go on. There's no reason to presume that there were 3 different Gospels, as we were talking about, called the Gospel according to the Hebrews. It's certainly clear that the Nazarenes and the Ebionites used different versions. Epiphanius describes the version used by the Ebionites as called according to Matthew, which, however, is not wholly complete and mutilated. However, is not wholly complete but falsified and mutilated. However, in speaking of the Nazarenes, he refers to their Gospel of Matthew as quite complete in the Hebrew, as it was first written in Hebrew letters. So it appears that the Ebionite version was not wholly complete but falsified and mutilated, while the Nazarene version was quite complete, preserved as it was first written. We already kind of covered that. We're covering it again. This explains why the Ebionite version omitted the birth narrative and opened with the ministry of Yochanan, according to Panarion, book 30, chapter 13, section 6, while the Nazarene version is known to have included material from paralleling the first 2 chapters of Matthew. All right, the Synoptic Source. This is where it gets really, really important. Remember, I said this is the original Jewish gospel from which our synoptic was the source document for our 4 gospels, and especially our 3 synoptic gospels. And many scholars have, over the years, recognized this fact that the Gospel according to the Hebrews is key to gospel origins, and particularly the origin of the synoptics. A scholar, let's see here, in the Walter F. Adney wrote in the Hilbert Journal in 1778. Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who's pretty well known as a key figure in gospel origins and what's called the documentary theory, the Q theory, as it's called. He lived from between 1729 and 1781. Also is known as founder of the scientific method, by the way. Proposed the idea that the Gospel according to the Hebrews was the primary source for our synoptic Gospels. In 1866, Hilgenfeld concluded, quote, "At length, the Gospel according to the Hebrews offers those of us who are investigating the origins of the Gospels the punctuum Archimedes, or point of origin, which so many learned men have vainly sought in the Gospel according to Mark." In 1905, A.S. Barnes proposed an identification between the Gospel according to the Hebrews and the Logia document, which many scholars associate with the hypothetical Q document. Barnes writes, it is possible seriously to Is it possible seriously, is it possible seriously to maintain that there were two separate documents, each of them written in Jerusalem during the Apostolic Age and in the Hebrew language, each of them assigned to the Apostle Matthew, and each of them dealing in some way with the gospel story? Or are we not rather forced to the conclusion that these two documents, uh, whose descriptions are so strangely similar, must really be identical? In other words, he's saying that this theoretical source document called Q, for that was the in Logia, this theoretical gospel source document for the three synoptic gospels, um, and the gospel according to the Hebrews are the same. They must be the same. They both fit the same description. Um, so very early on in the early 20th century, in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, scholars are recognizing, key scholars have recognized uh, that the gospel according to the Hebrews must play some key role in the origins of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In 1940, Pearson Parker concluded that a close connection existed between the Gospel according to the Hebrews and the hypothetical Proto-Luke and the hypothetical L source document. The presence in this, he wrote, quote, the presence in this gospel of Lucan qualities and parallels, the absence from it of definitive Markan elements, and all point to one conclusion, that the source of the gospel according to the Hebrews was most closely associated to sources underlying the non-Markan parts of Luke, that is, Proto-Luke. We're going to look at this more later in relation to Luke as we continue this study. Hugh Schoenfield, in his book According to the Hebrews in 1937, pages 13 through 18, wrote, "It may be argued that there has been dependence not of Hebrews on the synoptics, but vice versa, that Hebrews was one of the sources on which one or more of them drew." So there's a good deal of academic evidence, if you will, of academic study in the 19th and 20th centuries at least, into the idea that the Gospel according to the Hebrews was in fact the source document or closely tied to the source document behind our three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So let's talk about the Gospel according to the Hebrews and Matthew. You noticed earlier when we were talking and we were quoting from Epiphanius, identified the Gospel according to the Hebrews with Matthew, and talking about that the Ebionites used the Gospel according to the Hebrews, which was called Matthew. And all the other church fathers frequently refer to the Ebionites as using the Gospel of Matthew, only Matthew, and using only Matthew. But Jerome says that the Nazarenes and Ebionites both use the Gospel according to the Hebrews. This is all pointing to the idea that they're one and the same. So the so-called church fathers don't hesitate at hinting that Matthew's source document was the Gospel according to the Hebrews. In fact, they actually identify our Gospel of Matthew with the Gospel according to the Hebrews. Jerome writes in his commentary on Matthew 12:13, "In the Gospel which the Nazarenes and Ebionites used, which I have translated into Greek from the Hebrew, and which is called by many the original of Matthew." So Jerome in the 4th century says, look, many people call this Gospel according to the Hebrews the original of Matthew. He's not the only church father to identify the two documents. Irenaeus says that the Ebionites used only the Gospel of Matthew in his Heresies 1:26-2, while Eusebius says that the Ebionites used only the Gospel called according to the Hebrews in Ecclesiastical History 3:27-4. And Epiphanius writes that the Ebionite Gospel is called the Gospel according to Matthew or the Gospel according to the Hebrews in Penarion 30:16, 4 through 5. Moreover, Jerome seems to refer to the original Hebrew of Matthew and the Gospel according to the Hebrews interchangeably in his writings. This led Hugh Schoenfield, in his 1927 translation of the Dutile Hebrew version of Matthew, to write the following. He says, "My own opinion is that the canonical Gospel of Matthew is an abridged edition of a larger work of which fragments still survive. I believe that this proto-evangel, this prior gospel, if you will, was written in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. Whatever may have been its original title, we have early allusions to it under the name of the Gospel of the Lord, the Gospel of the 12, or of the Apostles, and the Gospel of the Hebrews, and the Hebrew Matthew." So Hugh Schoenfield in 1927, in his book on the Dutile Hebrew version of Matthew, concludes that Hebrew Matthew, or even Matthew, if you will, our canonical Matthew, is actually an abridged version of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. In fact, 10 years later, when he wrote his book according to the Hebrews, he writes, Schoenfield again writes, "The only difficulty, in fact, that stands in the way of accepting the Greek of Matthew, in other words, our canonical Matthew, as really translated from the Hebrew of Matthew instead of vice versa, is undoubtedly the irrefutable evidence that Greek Matthew has largely used Mark." Finally, he comes to the conclusion on page 254. He wrote that in According to the Hebrews, page 248. On page 254, he comes to the conclusion, the strong probability that Hebrews was one of the sources of canonical Matthew. Here's the thing. Schoenfield was not mistaken in his 1937 statement referring to the irrefutable evidence that Greek Matthew has largely used Mark. He was mistaken. He was mistaken when he said in 1937 that the only problem with this idea is that we know that Greek Matthew basically is used Mark, the Gospel of Mark. This misconception was the only thing that held Schoenfield back from concluding that Greek Matthew, or our canonical Matthew, is a translation of Hebrew Matthew, and that Hebrew Matthew was an abridgment of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. That's what he wanted to conclude, but he had this fly in the ointment, if you will. The only flaw was that everybody knows that Matthew was dependent on Mark. But if we remove the barrier of presumed Markan priority, we can adopt the logical conclusion that Schoenfield hesitated from, that our book of Matthew is actually an abridgment of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So guess what? Comes to our next handout. Mark is secondary. The original documentary theory claimed that Matthew and Luke were dependent on a collection of sayings known as the Logia, or Q, Q being from the German Quell, meaning source, and a narrative document usually identified as Mark. So the accepted wisdom of source criticism is that Matthew and Luke are dependent upon Mark and another document known as Q. Streeter developed this theory further. He realized that Luke and Matthew contained narratives in common that could not be found in Mark. He attributed these to a third document which he called Proto-Luke. Proto-Luke was said to have incorporated into it Q, the non-Markan portions of Luke, and the narrative material which Luke and Matthew held in common. However, the late Dr. Robert Lindsay made further observations. Lindsay points out that the phrase kaiuthos in Greek and immediately occurs in Mark over 40 times. Luke contains the phrase only once, and then in a position that has no parallel in Mark. Lindsay pointed out that this is unimaginable, that Luke systematically purged the phrase and immediately from every portion of Mark that he used, especially since he uses the phrase himself elsewhere. So in other words, he didn't have any problem using the phrase. This means that Luke could not have copied from Mark, and that Mark therefore had to have copied from Luke. If we eliminate all the Lucan passages from Mark, then almost everything else that can be found in Matthew. In fact, this is important, only 31 verses of Mark cannot be found in either Luke or Matthew. In other words, only 5% of the book of Mark is original. Everything else in Mark can be found in Matthew and Luke. It's clear as a result that Mark was compiled using Luke and Matthew. The following three facts support this conclusion. 1, when Mark and Matthew differ in chronology, Luke agrees with Mark. 2, when Mark and Luke differ in chronology, Matthew agrees with Mark. And 3, Matthew and Luke never agree in chronology against Mark. Mark, therefore, is secondary. This completely destroys the standard academic paradigm. Okay? Mark, therefore, is secondary, and this was the great discovery of Dr. Robert Lindsay that has been overlooked by so many, and which, when brought together with Schonfield's observations, eliminates the barrier that Schonfield was up against, and therefore Schonfield's logical conclusion follows through. Mark is secondary, then Matthew is actually an abridgment of the gospel according to the Hebrews. So Mark, therefore, is secondary, compiled from Matthew and Luke with only 31 lines of original material. It plays no important place in synoptic origins. Lindsay's proto-Mark was probably actually the gospel according to the Hebrews itself. All right, our next handout, Luke uses the gospel according to the Hebrews as a source. Many scholars look to a hypothetical proto-Luke as the source behind the material unique to Luke, but not found in Matthew and Mark. In 1940, we quoted this before, Pearson Parker concluded that a close connection existed between the Gospel according to the Hebrews and this hypothetical proto-Luke document. He said the presence in this Gospel of Lucan elements and parallels, the absence from it of definitive Markan elements, all point to one conclusion, that the source of the Gospel according to the Hebrews was most closely related to sources underlying the non-Markan elements of Luke, that is, Proto-Luke. Now, of course, all of this is based upon standard model theory that we just blew out of the water. But it is important to realize that Pearson Parker had noticed the strong connection between Luke and unique Luke material and the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So I think we can easily conclude that the material unique to Luke doesn't really come from a proto-Luke or an else source at all, but actually from the Gospel according to the Hebrews. To begin with, Luke admits having had source documents when writing his Gospel. In the first 4 verses of Luke. He specifically talks about using source material. And the fact is that several of the surviving readings from the Gospel according to the Hebrews parallel Luke only and not Matthew. For example, only Luke gives Yeshua's age as being 30 at the time of his immersion. Only Luke includes the account of Yeshua being comforted by an angel. Only Luke includes the discussion about eating the Passover as described in Luke 22:45. And only Luke includes Yeshua's words at the crucifixion, Father, forgive them. All of these are found in the surviving Gospel according to the Hebrews fragments. There are no Lucan elements given in the Gospel according to the Hebrews material that also parallel Matthew. The immersion account is cited by Ephanius also includes the words in the form of a dove, talking about the Ruach HaKodesh descending in the form of a dove, as in Luke's account, and the phrase, I have this day begotten you, as in Luke's account, as it is found in the Greek Western type text of Codex D. There are three major Greek text types of the New Testament. There's the Western type, the Alexandrian type, and the Byzantine type. And the Western type, and we'll do a video on that someday, on these three text types and how they're also key to gospel origins and to scripture origins, and how they also point to the Hebrew and Aramaic origin of the New Testament. But the correlation with the Greek Western type text of Codex D is extremely important. I said we'll have to visit that in the future because there is good evidence that the Western type of text is more original. It's certainly more Semitic than the other two text types. So if Mark is secondary and not primary, as we have found that it is, we should expect that the synoptic sources would have readings which parallel Matthew only, readings which parallel only Luke, and readings which are common to Matthew and Luke and sometimes Mark, but not expect readings that parallel only Mark, and that's exactly the case in the Gospel according to the Hebrews. And also, by the way, it stands to reason that if the Gospel according to the Hebrews is an abridgment, if our Matthew, is an abridgment of the Gospel according to the Hebrews, then the Lucan elements in the Gospel according to the Hebrews point to it being the source for Luke as well. So the Gospel according to the Hebrews is the source for Matthew, in that our Gospel of Matthew is a abridgment of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. It is a source for Luke to the extent that Luke says in the first 4 verses of chapter 1 that source material was used to compile the book of Luke, and so it was one of the sources for Luke, which is why then you have a great deal of synoptic material or parallel material found in both Matthew and Luke, and that then Matthew and Luke were used by Mark in writing his gospel, and this is why 95% of the Gospel of Mark can be found in Matthew or Luke. And this all points to the importance of the Gospel according to the Hebrews being the original Jewish gospel and the original source gospel. As a side note, there's also passages in the Gospel according to the Hebrews that appear to be the sources for things that we find in the Gospel of John or Yochanan. So where does this leave us? Well, one of the projects of the Gospel according to, one of the projects of, or parts of, the Scripture Restoration Project is going to be restoring the Gospel according to the Hebrews. I'm going to tell you how that's done, or going to be done in just a minute. Before I go that far, I need to pause and ask everybody to please consider donating to this work, both The project, when I say this work, inclusive of the scripture restoration project that I'm working on, other projects that I'm working on, the Halakha project that you may know about if you've been watching my videos, the videos themselves, the blogs that I write and publish, seems like nearly every day on Nazarene Space slash blog .com/blog, and so on and so forth. All of this scholarship that I'm sharing with you takes hours of my time to research and compile, and has taken hours and literally decades of my life to compile and put together. And as many of you know, my wife is disabled and chronically ill and suffers from chronic pain, and I'm her caretaker here at the house as well. I do much of my research and my work at a table that is, a table that's about 6 feet away from her bed, um, so that I can see to her needs, take care of her, and be easily accessible to her while I'm doing research and work. Sometimes I'm able to get away and do work in the study here, but a lot of it I do out there. Okay. Um, and the reason I say this, we need your financial support, either tzedakah, alms, because uh, we're in a bad situation here with my wife's health and me having to be home to take care of her, or tithes and offerings to support me in the work that I'm doing uh, uh, in these videos and Scripture Restoration Project, the Halakha Project, the online commentaries, etc. Donations can be sent by PayPal to donations@wnae.org. That's W as in world, N as in Nazarene, A as in Elohim, um, A is in assembly, sorry, and E is in Elohim.org. And I will post a link where you can donate in the description to this video. All right. So how will we put Humpty Dumpty back together again? I actually did a reconstruction of the Gospel according to the Hebrews on a very primitive level many years ago, but it's not sufficient. Much better work is now possible based on more information that I have compiled over the years. So our starting point is Hebrew Matthew, which is one of the reasons that we're working on and the Scripture Restoration Project, reconstructing the original Hebrew of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the rest of the so-called New Testament. But key to this, of course, is Matthew and Luke. We'll be restoring the original Hebrew of Matthew using a variety of sources, including Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew that have come to light, the Dutile Hebrew version of Matthew and the Shem Tov Hebrew version of Matthew, the Munster Hebrew text of Matthew, etc. Plus looking to the Hebrew behind Greek Matthew and using all that information to put the original Hebrew Matthew back together again. That original Hebrew Matthew then is also the starting point for putting the Gospel according to the Hebrews back together again. Because the Gospel according to the Hebrews is, or Hebrew Matthew is, the original Hebrew Matthew is an abridgment of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So then we have Hebrew Luke that we're going to be putting back to, we are in the process of putting back together again. And for that, we have a manuscript that contains the first portion, much of the first chapter of Luke in Hebrew, and we also have from our Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew, we have the synoptic parallel material that we can then carry over and transplant into its proper places in Luke, and then we also have Luke and Matthew in Aramaic, ancient Aramaic versions. And Aramaic and Hebrew are very similar languages. They use the same 22-letter alphabet, and they use much of the same vocabulary. The vowels are often different primarily, but that's easily accounted for, and they use much of the same grammar. So if you have a literal Aramaic translation of a Hebrew document, you can really see most of the Hebrew behind that document. Unlike looking at a Greek text, you can see Hebrew behind it with some, uh, if, but not to the degree of accuracy that you can see the Hebrew behind a literal Aramaic translation. Okay, so that's the process that was. Then we have about 50 fragments of the Gospel according to the Hebrews that have been found or that are located in the Church Fathers and some sources from the Middle Ages. And when the Gospel according to the Hebrews apparently survived into the Middle Ages, but hasn't survived today. And those can be put in their proper locations. There's also some information that I'll be documenting that pretty technical that will allow us to add at least a couple more fragments of information from some other sources that we're able to then identify actually originally came from the Gospel according to the Hebrews. So we'll be able to put all these in their proper locations and put the original source document behind Matthew and Luke back together again, insert the Gospel according to the Hebrews fragments in their proper locations, and the end result will be a restored copy of the Gospel according to the Hebrews. I won't guarantee that it's not lacking some paragraph here or there, but if we had found the document that we're going to be recreating and found the original, an actual copy of the Gospel according to the Hebrews, what we would look at and say, oh, it's a variant copy. It was missing a paragraph or something here or there, or missing a verse here or there, but it would be sufficient, I believe. I am led to believe, I'm convinced in the calling to which I've been directed that it will be sufficient for our needs in this regard. All right, so once again, I want to remind you and encourage you to support this work. Our rent is, if you're watching this live, or not live, but soon, today is September 27th of 2021. Our rent will be due soon, and frankly, we don't have it. And it'll be due on the 1st. So we need your financial support to make this work happen, to eat and pay rent and survive while doing this work, so that I am doing this work in either in the chair, sorry, in the at the table 6 feet from my wife, or in my study, and not my wife and I homeless on the streets with her illnesses and whatnot. I mean, she couldn't be on the street. I don't know what would happen, but we definitely need your financial support. So donations at wnae.org, and I will include the link to donate at the bottom of this video. All right, thanks everybody. Talking about in the description of this video. Shalom everybody, thanks for listening, and we have lots more to share with you in coming days. Shalom.